What's going on, guys? Galen Joker back with Chapter 5 of Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. It's Friday. Lovely. Not my Friday. My Friday's Sunday. But today we're going to read Chapter 5. Then we're going to take a break over the weekend and pick up on Chapter 6 on Monday. I do have a couple of videos planned for tomorrow and Sunday, so I'm not going to be without videos. However, the book will be continued on Monday. So Chapter 5, I play Pinnacle with a horse. I had weird dreams full of barnyard animals, most of them wanting to kill me. The rest wanted food. I must have woken up several times, but when I heard and saw made no sense, so I just passed out again. I remember lying on a soft bed being spoon-fed something that tasted like buttered popcorn, only it was pudding. The girl with curly blonde hair hovered over me, smirking as she scraped drips off my chin with a spoon. When she saw my eyes open, she asked, "What will happen to the summer solstice?" I managed to croak, "What?" She looked around as if afraid someone would overhear. "What's going on? What was stolen? We've only got a few weeks." "Sorry," I mumbled. "I don't." Somebody knocked on the door and the girl quickly filled my mouth with pudding. The next time I woke up, the girl was gone. A husky blonde dude like a surfer stood in the corner of the bedroom, keeping watch over me. He had blue eyes, at least a dozen of them, on his cheeks, on his forehead, and backs of his hands. Page 59. When I finally came around for good, there was nothing weird about my surroundings, except that they were nicer than I was used to. I was sitting in the deck chair on a huge porch gazing across the meadow at green hills in the distance. The breeze smelled like strawberries. There was a blanket over my legs, a pillow behind my neck. All was great, but my mouth felt like a scorpion had been using it for a nest. My tongue was dry and nasty, and every one of my teeth hurt. On the table next to me was a tall drink. It looked like iced apple juice and a green straw with a paper parasol stuck through the maraschino cherry. Sorry. My hand was as weak as I almost dropped the glass once, and I got my fingers around it. "Careful," a familiar voice said. Grover was leaning across against the porch railing, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. Under one arm, he cradled a shoebox. He was wearing blue jeans, Converse high tops, and a bright orange t-shirt that said Camp Half-Blood. Just plain old Grover, not the goat boy. So maybe I had a nightmare. Maybe my mom was okay. We were still on vacation, and we'd stopped here at the big house for some reason, and... "You saved my life," Grover said. Well, the least I could do. I went back to the hill. I thought you might want this." Reverently, he placed the shoebox in my lap. Inside was a black and white bull's horn, a base jagged from being broken off, the tip splattered with dried blood. It hadn't been a nightmare. "The Minotaur," I said. Percy, it isn't a good idea." "That's what they call him in Greek myths, isn't it?" I demanded. "The Minotaur, half man, half bull." Grover shifted uncomfortably. "You've been out for 2 days. How much do you remember?" "My mom. Is she really?" He looked down. I stared across the meadow. There was groves of trees and winding stream. Acres of strawberries spread under the blue sky. The valley was surrounded by rolling hills, and the tallest one, directly in front of us, was the one with the huge pine tree on top. Even that looked beautiful in the sunlight. My mother was gone. The whole world should be black and cold. Nothing should look beautiful. "I'm sorry," Grover sniffled. "I'm a failure. I'm the worst satyr in the world." He moaned, stomping his foot so hard it came off. The Converse high top came off. The inside was filled with styrofoam, except for a hoof-shaped hole. "Oh, sticks," he mumbled. Thunder rolled across the clear sky. As he struggled to get his hoof back on the fake foot, I thought, well, that settles it. Grover was a satyr. I was ready to bet that I shaved his curly brown hair. I'd find tiny horns on his head, but I was too miserable to care that satyrs existed, or even minotaurs. Page 61. All that meant was my mom really had been squeezed into nothingness, dissolved in the yellow light. I was alone, an orphan. I would have to live with smelly Gabe. No, that would never happen. I would live on the streets first. I would pretend I was 17 and join the army. I'd do something. Grover was still sniffling. The poor kid, the poor goat, satyr, whatever, looked as if he expected to be hit. I said, "It wasn't your fault. Yes, it was. I was supposed to protect you. Did my mother ask you to protect me? No, but that's my job. I'm a keeper. At least, I was. But why? I suddenly felt dizzy, my vision swimming. Don't strain yourself, Grover said. Here. He helped me hold the glass and put the straw on my lips. I recoiled at the taste because I was expecting apple juice. It wasn't that at all. It was chocolate chip cookies, liquid cookies, and not just any cookies. My mom's homemade blue chocolate chip cookies, buttery and hot, with the chips still melting. Drinking it, my whole body felt warm and good, full of energy. My grief didn't go away, but I felt as if my mom had just brushed her hand across my cheek, giving me a cookie the way she used to when I was small, and told me everything was going to be okay. Before I knew it, I drained the glass. I stared into it, sure I'd just had a warm drink, but the ice cubes hadn't even melted. Was it good? Grover asked. I nodded. What did it taste like? He sounded so wistful. I felt guilty. Sorry, I said. I should have let you taste. His eyes got wide. No, that's not what I meant. I just wondered. Chocolate chip cookies, I said. My mom's homemade. He sighed. And how do you feel? Like I could throw Nancy Boba Fett 100 yards. That's good, he said. That's good. I don't think you could risk drinking any more of that stuff. What do you mean? He took the empty glass from me gingerly, as if it were dynamite, and set it back on the table. Come on, Kyron and Mr. D are waiting. The porch wrapped all the way around the farmhouse. My legs felt wobbly trying to walk that far. Grover offered to carry the Minotaur horn, but I held on to it. I'd paid for that souvenir the hard way. I wasn't going to let it go. As he came around the opposite end of the house, I caught my breath. We must have been on the north shore of the Long Island, because on this side of the house the valley marched all the way up the water, which glittered about a mile in the distance. Between here and there, I simply couldn't process everything I was seeing. The landscape was dotted with page 63. If I could get the page to turn. The landscape was dotted with buildings that looked like ancient Greek architecture. It was open-air pavilion and amphitheater and circular arena, except that they all looked brand new, their white marble columns sparkling in the sun. In a nearby sandpit, a dozen high school-aged kids and satyrs played volleyball. Canoes glided across a small lake. Kids in bright orange t-shirts like Grover's were chasing each other around a cluster of cabins nestled in the woods. Some shot targets at an archery range, others rode horses down a wooden trail, and unless I was hallucinating, some of their horses had wings. Down at the end of the porch, two men sat across from each other on the card table. The blonde-haired girl who'd spoon-fed me popcorn-flavored pudding was leaning on the porch rail next to them. The man facing me was small but porky. He had a red nose, big watery eyes, and curly hair so black it was almost purple. He looked like those paintings of baby angels. What do you call them? Hubbubs. No, cherubs. That's it. He looked like a cherub who'd turned middle-aged in the trailer park. He wore a tiger-patterned Hawaiian shirt, and he would have fit right in one of Gabe's poker parties, except I got the feeling this guy could have out-gambled every step, even my stepfather. That's Mr. D, Grover murmured to me. He's the camp director. Be polite. The girl, that's Annabeth Chase. She's just a camper, but she's been here longer than just about anybody, and you already know Kyron. He pointed at the guy whose back was to me. First, I realized he was sitting in the wheelchair. Then I recognized the tweed jacket and the thinning brown hair and the scraggly beard. Mr. Brunner, I cried. The Latin teacher turned and smiled at me. His eyes had that mischievous glint that sometimes got in class when he pulled a pop quiz and made all the multiple choice answers B. Ah, good, Percy, he said. Now we have 4 for Pinnacle. He offered me a chair to the right of Mr. D, who looked at me with bloodshot eyes and heaved a great sigh. Oh, I suppose I must say it. Welcome to Camp Half-Blood. There. Now don't expect me to be glad to see you. Thanks. I scooted a little further away from him because if there was one thing I had learned from living with Gabe, it was how to tell when an adult has been hitting the happy juice. If Mr. D was a stranger to alcohol, I was a satyr. Annabeth, Mr. Brunner called to the blonde girl. She came forward and Mr. Brunner introduced us. This young lady nursed you back to health, Percy. Annabeth, my dear, why don't you go check on Percy's bunks? We'll be putting him in cabin 11 for now. Annabeth said, Sure, Chiron. She was probably my age, maybe a couple of inches taller, and a whole lot more athletic looking. With her deep tan and her curly blonde hair, she was almost exactly what I thought a stereotypical California girl would look like, except her eyes were in the image. They were startling gray like storm clouds, pretty but intimidating too, as if she were analyzing the best way to take me down in a fight. Page 65. She glanced at the Minotaur horn in my hand, then back to me. I imagined she was going to say, You killed a Minotaur? Or, Wow, you're so awesome, or something like that. Instead, she said, You drool when you sleep. Then she sprinted off down the lawn, her blonde hair flying behind her. So, I said, anxious to change the subject. You, work here, Mr. Brunner? Not Mr. Brunner, the ex-Mr. Brunner said. I'm afraid that was my synonym. You call me Chiron. Okay, totally confused. I looked at the director. And Mr. D, does that stand for something? Mr. D stopped shuffling the cards. He looked at me like I'd just belched or something. Young man, names are powerful things. You don't just go around using them for no reason. Oh, right. Sorry. I must say, Percy, Chiron Brunner broke in, I'm glad to see you alive. It's been a long time since I've made a house call to a potential camper. I'd hate to think I'd wasted my time. House call? My year at Yancey Academy, he instructed you. To instruct you. We have satyrs at most schools, of course, keeping a lookout, but Grover alerted me as soon as he met you. He sensed you were something special, so I decided to come upstate. I convinced the other Latin teacher to, take a leave of absence. I tried to remember the beginning of the school year. It seemed like so long ago, but I did have a fuzzy memory of there being another Latin teacher my first week at Yancey. Then, without explanation, he disappeared and Mr. Brunner had taken the class. You came to Yancey to teach me? I asked. Chiron nodded. Honestly, I wasn't sure about you at first. We contacted your mother, let her know we were keeping an eye on you in case you were ready for Camp Half-Blood, but you still had too much to learn. Nevertheless, you made it here alive, and that's always the first test. Grover, Mr. D said impatiently, are you playing or not? Yes, sir. Grover trembled as he took the fourth chair, though I didn't know why he should be so afraid of Pudgy, little man in a tiger print Hawaiian shirt. You do know how to play Pinnacle, Mr. D eyed me suspiciously. I'm afraid not, I said. I'm afraid not, sir, he said. Sir, I repeated. I was liking the camp director less and less. Well, he told me, it is, along with the gladiator fighting and Pac-Man, one of the greatest games ever invented by humans. I would expect all civilized young men to know the rules. Page 67. I'm sure the boy can learn, Chiron said. Please, I said. What is this place? What am I doing here? Chiron, why would you go to Yancey Academy to teach me? Mr. D snorted. I asked the same question. The camp director dealt the cards. Grover flinched every time one landed in his pile. Chiron smiled at me sympathetically, the way he used to in Latin class, as if to let me know that no matter what my average was, I was his star student. He expected me to have the right answer. Percy, he said, did your mother tell you nothing? She said, I remembered her eyes looking out over the sea. She told me she was afraid to send me here, even though my father had wanted her to. She said that once I was here, I probably couldn't leave. She wanted to keep me close to her. Typical, Mr. D said. That's how they usually get killed. Young men are you bidding or not? What? I asked. He explained impatiently. How you bid in Pinnacle. And so I did. I'm afraid there's too much to tell, Chiron said. I'm afraid our usual orientation film won't be sufficient. Orientation film? I asked. No, Chiron decided. Well, Percy, you know your friend Grover is a satyr. You know, he pointed to the horn in the shoebox, that you killed the Minotaur. No small feat either, lad. What you may not know is that the great powers are at work in your life. Gods, the forces you call the Greek gods, are very much alive. I stared at the others around the table. I waited for somebody to yell, not, but all I got was Mr. D yelling, oh, a royal marriage, trick, trick, he crackled as he tallied up his points. Mr. D, Grover asked timidly, if you're not going to eat it, could I have your Diet Coke can? Oh, all right. Grover bit a huge shard out of the empty aluminum can and chewed it mournfully. Wait, I told Chiron. You're telling me there's such a thing as God? Well, now, Chiron said. God, capital G, God. That's a different matter altogether. We shan't deal with that. Metaphysical. Metaphysical? But you were just talking about gods, plural, as in great beings that control the forces of nature and human endeavors. The immortal gods of Olympus. That's the smaller matter. Smaller? Yes, quite. The gods we discussed in last class. Zeus, I said. Hera, Apollo, you mean them? And there it was again, distant thunder in the cloudless day. Young man, said Mr. D, I would really be less casual about throwing those names around if I were you. But they're stories, I said. They're myths to explain lightning and the seasons and stuff. That's what people believed before there was science. Page 69. Science? Mr. D scoffed. And tell me, Perseus Jackson. I flinched when he said my real name, which I had never told anybody. What will people think of your science 2,000 years from now? Mr. D continued. They will call it a primitive mumbo jumbo. That's what. Oh, I love mortals. They have absolutely no sense of perspective. They think they've come so far, and have they? Chiron, look at this boy and tell me. I wasn't liking Mr. D much, but there was something about him, the way he called me mortal, as if he wasn't. It was enough to put a lump in my throat. So to suggest why Grover had difficulty minding his cards, chewing his soda can, and keeping his mouth shut. Percy, Chiron said, you may choose to believe it or not, but the fact is that immortal means immortal. Can you imagine that for a moment? Never dying, never fading, existing just as you are for all time? I was about to answer off the top of my head that it sounded a pretty good deal, but the tone in Chiron's voice made me hesitate. You mean whether people believed in you or not? I said. Exactly, Chiron agreed. If you were a god, how would you like being called a myth? An old story to explain lightning? What if I told you, Perseus Jackson, that someday people would call you a myth, just created to explain how little boys can get over losing their mothers? My heart pounded. He was trying to make me angry for some reason, but I wasn't going to let him. I said, I wouldn't like it, but I don't believe in gods. Oh, you'd better, Mr. D murmured, before one of them incinerates you. Grover said, but please, sir, he's just lost his mother. He's in shock. Lucky thing, too, Mr. D grumbled, playing a card. Bad enough I'm confined to this miserable job working with boys who don't even believe. He waved his hand and a goblet appeared on the table. As if the sunlight had bent momentarily and woven the air into glass, the goblet filled itself with red wine. My jaw dropped, but Chiron hardly looked up. Mr. D, he warned, your restrictions. Mr. D looked at the wine in feigned surprise. Dear me, he looked at the sky and yelled, old habits. Sorry. More thunder. Mr. D waved his hand again, and the wine glass changed into a fresh can of Diet Coke. He sighed unhappily, popped the top of the soda, and went back to his card game. Chiron winked at me. Mr. D offended his father a while back, took a fancy to a wood nymph, and now been declared off limits. A wood nymph? I repeated, still staring at the Diet Coke can like it was from outer space. Yes, Mr. D confessed. Father loves to punish me. The first time, prohibition. Ghastly. Absolutely horrid. 10 years? Second time, well, she was really pretty, and I couldn't stay away. The second time, he sent me here, Half-Blood Hill. Summer camp for brats like you. Be a better influence, he told me. Work with youths rather than tearing them down. Ha! Absolutely unfair. Mr. D sounded about 6 years old, like a pouting little kid, and I stammered, your father is the Immortalis, Chiron. Mr. D said, I thought you taught this boy the basics. My father is Zeus, of course. I ran through D names from the Greek mythology, wine, the skin of a tiger, the satyrs that all seemed to work here. The way Grover cringed as if Mr. D were his master. You're Dionysus, I said, the god of wine. Mr. D rolled his eyes. What do they say these days, Grover? Do the children say, well, duh? Yes, Mr. D. Then, well, duh, Percy Jackson. Did you think I was Aphrodite? Perhaps. You're a god. Yes, child, a god. You? He turned to look at me straight on and I saw a kind of purplish fire in his eyes. A hint that was whiny, plump little man that was only showing me the tiniest bit of his true nature. Saw visions of grapevines choking unbelievers to death, drunken warriors insane with battle lust, sailors screaming as their hands turned to flippers, their faces elegating into dolphin snouts. I knew that if I punished him, Mr. D would show me worse things. If I pushed him, Mr. D would show me worse things. He would plant a disease in my brain that would leave me wearing a straitjacket in a rubber room for the rest of my life. Would you like to test me, child? He said quietly. No, no, sir. The fire died a little. He turned back to his card game. I believe I win. Not quite, Mr. D, Chiron said. He sat down straight, tallied the points, and said, The game goes to me. Thought Mr. D was going to vaporize Chiron right out of his wheelchair, but he just sighed through his nose as if he were used to being beaten by the Latin teacher. He got up and Grover rose too. I'm tired, Mr. D said. I believe I'll take a nap before the sing-along tonight, but first, Grover, we need to talk. Again. About your less than perfect performance on this assignment. Grover's face beaded with sweat. Yes, sir. Mr. D turned to me. Cabin 11, Percy Jackson, and mind your manners. He swept into the farmhouse, Grover following miserably. Will Grover be okay? I asked Chiron. Chiron nodded, though he looked a bit troubled. Old Dionysus isn't really mad. He just hates this job. He's been, grounded, I guess you would say, and he can't stand waiting another century before he's allowed back on Olympus. Page 73. Mount Olympus, I said? You're telling me there really is a palace there. Well, now there's a Mount Olympus in Greece, and there's the home of the gods, the convergence point of their powers, which did indeed used to be Mount Olympus. Still called Mount Olympus out of the respect of the old ways, but the palace moves, Percy, just as the gods do. You mean the Greek gods are here, like in America? Well, certainly, the gods move with the heart of the West. The what? Come now, Percy, what do you call Western civilization? Do you think it's just an abstract concept? No, it's a living force, a collective consciousness that has burned bright for thousands of years. The gods are part of that. You might even say they are the source of it. Or at least they are tied so tightly to it that they couldn't possibly fade. Not unless all of Western civilization were obliterated. The fire started in Greece, then as you well know, or as I hope you know, since you passed my course, the heart of the fire moved to Rome, and so did the gods. Oh, different names perhaps, Jupiter for Zeus, Venus for Aphrodite, and so on, but the same forces, same gods. And then they died. Died? No. Did the West die? The gods simply moved to Germany, to France, to Spain for a while. Wherever the flames were brightest, the gods were there. They spent several centuries in England. All you need to do is look at the architecture. People do not forget the gods. Every place they've ruled for the last 3,000 years, and you can see them in paintings and statues on the most important buildings. And yes, Percy, of course they are now in your United States. Look at your symbol, the eagle of Zeus. Look at the statue, the Prometheus in Rockefeller Center. The Greek facades of your government buildings in Washington. I defy you to find any American city where the Olympians are not prominently displayed in multiple places, like or not. And believe me, plenty of people weren't very fond of Rome either. America is now the heart of the flame. It is in the great power of the West, and so Olympus is here, and we are here. It was all too much, especially the fact I seemed to be included in Chiron's we, as if I were part of some club. Who are you, Chiron? Who am I? Chiron smiled. He shifted his weight as if he were going to get out of his wheelchair, but I knew that was impossible. He was paralyzed from the waist down. Who are you? He mused. Well, that's the question we all want answered, isn't it? But for now, we should get you to a bunk in cabin 11. There will be friends to meet and plenty of time for lessons tomorrow. Besides, there will be s'mores at the campfire tonight, and I simply adore chocolate. And then he did rise from his wheelchair, but there was something odd about the way he did. His blanket fell away from his legs, but the legs didn't move. His waist kept getting longer, rising above his belt, and at first I thought he was wearing very long white velvet underwear. But as he kept rising out of the chair, taller than any man, I realized that the velvet underwear wasn't underwear. It was the front of an animal. Muscle and sinew under the coarse white fur. And the wheelchair wasn't a chair, it was some kind of container, an enormous box on wheels, and it must have been magic because there's no way it could have held all of them. A leg came out, long and knobbly kneed, and a huge polished hoof, then another front leg, then hindquarters, and then the box was empty. Nothing but a metal shell with a couple of fake human legs attached. I stared at the horse who had just sprung from the wheelchair, a huge white stallion, but where its neck should have been was the upper body of my Latin teacher, smoothly grafted to the horse's trunks. What a relief, the centaur said. I've been cooped up in there so long. My fetlocks have fallen asleep. Now, come, Percy Jackson, let's meet the other campers. Alright, guys, that's chapter 5. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you guys on Monday. Have a good night.